I'm Phoebe Boucher, Managing Editor of Raven Chronicles Press, and thank you for joining us for Raven Talk, Raven's online podcast. We are hosting mostly monthly conversations with writers, artists, and cultural warriors. Today, publisher Christine Holbert is talking to poet Carolyne Wright about the history of Lost Horse Press, and in particular, the Lost Horse Press contemporary Ukrainian poetry series. We'll have some time for questions afterwards. You can put comments in the chat. And then thanks to Tom Stiles for being our tech engineer this evening. He works for, among other things, Jack Straw Cultural Center. First, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and that we occupy this land. I want to thank our co-sponsors for funding this program and our magazines and books, the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, For Culture, King County Lodging Tax, the Washington State Arts Commission, with NEA funding for project support. Christine Holbert is founding director of Lost Horse Press and a founder of Spokane's Get Lit Literary Arts Festival. She earned an MA in publishing from Eastern Washington University. In 1998, she established Lost Horse Press, a nonprofit independent press that publishes collections of poems. She founded the Idaho Prize for Poetry, an annual book contest. She organizes creative writing workshops and literary readings, established the Lost Horse Press Contemporary Ukrainian Poetry Series, and the books are translations of preeminent Ukrainian poets and is presented in dual language format. And she's done a million other things, and we put her bio in the chat for you to read. Carolyne Wright's recent book is Masquerade, a memoir in poetry from Lost Horse Press, 2021. Previous books include This Dream the World, New and Selected Poems, again, Lost Horse Press, 2017, whose title poem won a Pushcart Prize and also appeared in the Best American Poetry of 2009. She co-edited the wonderful anthology Raising Lily Ledbetter, which was Women Poets Occupy the Workspace. Fabulous anthology. And that was Lost Horse again in 2015. And it received 10 Pushcart Prize nominations. Carolyne has also 5 earlier books of poetry, a volume of essays, and 5 award-winning volumes in translation from Spanish and Bengali. She's a contributing editor for the Pushcart Prizes, and she teaches for Seattle's Richard Hugo House and for conferences and literary centers nationwide. Please welcome Carolyne Wright.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for attending here, each in your own Zoom room. And we're very glad to be here, with great thanks to Phoebe, Raven Chronicles, Tom Stiles, who is our tech duende for the evening, and my greatest thanks especially for Christine Holbert. Christine Lysnewycz Holbert. I hope I'm pronouncing that Ukrainian surname correctly. Pardon?
You're close.
I'm close, yeah. I don't have that good Ukrainian accent, but I'll work on it. I think we'll just jump right into having our conversation here. I've had, Christine, I have known you now since 2005. We first met at the, I think it was the Associated Writing Programs Conference, or the AWP, Association of Writers and Writing Programs Conference in Vancouver, BC. And we were already in conversation about your publishing a book of mine. I had learned about you from Christopher Howell, the founding editor of Lynx House Press. And the two of you, Christopher Howell and Christine Holbert, with your presses that also have identical initials, LHP, have been working together for, 2.5 decades. So, but I wanted to ask you about how and why you founded Lost Horse Press. What led you to this vision of an independent nonprofit press focusing on poetry, of all things.
Right. Yeah, you would think that someone in their right mind wouldn't start a poetry press. It's very difficult. It's the least read genre in America, I think, and I didn't start out that way. When I started Lost Horse Press, I was in love with making books. I was in my 40s. I had returned to the university to finish my studies, and when I was younger, I didn't really have a calling. I didn't feel like and it's one of the reasons I dropped out of college when I was young, because I just wasn't sure what I loved to do, and I felt it was important to love what you do. I just thought that I didn't want to just take a job. So anyway, I raised my family and then had the opportunity to return to school, and while I was studying English literature, I found a notice that the Eastern Washington University Press needed interns. So I became an intern and discovered that that was my calling. I loved to make books. So when I started the press, it was mainly to have a job, to have something to do. I didn't want to move from the Pacific Northwest. I was just thinking of moving to Sandpoint, Idaho, to be near the lake, and I knew there weren't very many presses in the area. The computers were around, but it wasn't as prevalent to be working with each other. Editors from very far away were not working with one another via computer in the late 90s yet. So I thought to myself, well, I'm independent and I'll just start my own press. And at that time, I was going to publish everything. I would publish novels and short story collections and poetry, whatever came along that I loved. And I quickly learned that was not going to happen. That was just too much to bite off. And so I had to start thinking about focusing on something. And I love novels. Most of my private personal reading, I read fiction, but I became enamored of poetry because of the language, and number two, because my parents are both Ukrainian, but my mother really instilled in me a love of poetry. So until the day she died at age almost 95, she could recite huge passages from Taras Shevchenko's Kobzar. And Taras Shevchenko is the poet laureate of Ukraine since the late 1800s. He was an activist and an artist and a writer, and he wrote a lot of poetry about independence of Ukraine. So with that love of poetry and then rediscovering poetry again when I was working with books, I just thought, well, this is something I love. It's a genre I love, and there are so many poets who are looking for a publisher. There are way more poets than there are poetry presses, and so I thought this would be a important thing to do for the poetry community, and it would make me happy. This was the thing that was going to make me happy, and it has.
Well, this leads into my second question, which is really related. You were talking about your mother being able to recite, pages and pages and pages from memory of the great Ukrainian poet. And of course, we have more great Ukrainian poets now, but we'll get to that. You started out actually, though, in New York State. And then you came to the Pacific Northwest. And you could say a little bit about that. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background, about your parents, and how this will tie in,
Well, my parents were both born in Ukraine, and unfortunately, they were young when Stalin decided to have this famine. And so my mother's family was much more affected. She was from the northeast of Ukraine, from Chernihiv, Oblast. Oblast is like a state. So she was from that, which has now been leveled. I have some refugee Ukrainian friends here that just arrived recently, and they assured me that my mother's village was no longer standing. So my parents were both refugees after World War II. My dad is from the Lviv Oblast, just about 60 kilometers south of Lviv, from a village called Dusaniv, where still some of my family members reside. And in Lviv, we have Lysnewyches in Lviv and in Dusaniv. So my parents, after World War II, they had both been captured by Nazis and sent to Germany for forced labor. And after the war, they could go back to Ukraine. My mother was convinced that if they went back, that she would be murdered, because those people who had seen and made contact with the outside world, she was convinced that Stalin would not let those people live. And that's exactly what happened, because she had tried to contact different friends after the war, and there was no word of them. And then in the 80s, when Gorbachev had perestroika, there were some discoveries of mass graves in Ukraine, and it turns out that those were the graves of the people who were left over in Germany from forced labor, who had decided to go back to Ukraine, and they just never made it. So my parents chose to come to America, and they had a sponsor here, and so that's how I ended up being born in New York City, in the Lower East Village, which was the Ukrainian section of New York. So that's where I was born, and the little Ukrainian section had everything you could possibly need as a Ukrainian person. So my parents never learned to speak English, and of course they taught me to speak Ukrainian. So when we all moved up to upstate New York and I started school, the only language I knew was Ukrainian, and the only language my parents knew was Ukrainian. So my kindergarten teacher, Miss Bones, would drive me home from school and teach me English language, and then I would go home and teach my parents. So this is how we got along.
That's wonderful. And that's wonderful because I used to hear you when we were riding the trains to and from AWP conferences, and you would be on the cell phone with your mother and you were speaking Ukrainian. And I said, I couldn't understand almost anything, but it was amazing because so many kids raised in this country from other language and cultural backgrounds basically lose that language. But when they spoke to you in Ukrainian, you answered in Ukrainian, and you continued to do that. So,
right.
I have great admiration for that,
And that was quite common, that it was so painful for many Ukrainians coming to Canada and America at that time. They had such a horrible experience during the war that when they got to Canada or America, they said, no, we're going to become Americans and our children are going to speak English. They wanted to assimilate. And others, like my parents always taught me, you're Ukrainian, you should be proud of that. And you speak your language. And my mother always said, no, do not speak Russian. That's the language of the oppressor, and we don't speak that language. So they were very strict about that, just like some Ukrainian parents are strict about I know Ukrainians who they didn't even know that their parents spoke Ukrainian. They never heard it at home. Yeah, which is kind of a shame. You don't want to lose your culture just because of just because of Stalin. I would think. I was happy that my parents taught me my culture and my language. And I think that had a big effect on, what I'm doing now.
Well, that has totally led into, it's just so timely. Alas, that it's timely for such a horrible reason that we are, having almost this sort of replay of what looks like World War II, except it's taking place in color on our televisions.
Right.
But before we get to that, because you started the Ukrainian contemporary poetry series about, it must have been around 2014 or something, but
2017.
2017. Okay, right. But before we get to that, I want to ask a little bit about some of the other projects of Lost Horse Press, because when I first started working with you, and I'm so grateful for the books of mine that you've published and so many others by so many other poets in the Northwest as well as around the country. But what about how do poets find you? How does Lost Horse find the poets it publishes? And besides the individual collections that you publish, you have a couple of different series. The Idaho Prize, which is the annual prize for manuscripts, and then a number of series, the Native American Poets series, the Human Rights series, and the New Poets series, although I think that now is not operating. And then of course, back to the most recent series, which is the Ukrainian contemporary poetry series. Right?
Almost as though I was being groomed by a higher entity, yes, to start the Ukrainian poetry series. I had to go walk through fire before I was allowed to do it, almost.
Yeah.
And you asked about how do I find poets. At first, I was thinking that would be a daunting task to, how would anyone know about Lost Horse Press? But after the, second or third time that I went to AWP and people looked at some of the early books, then it wasn't difficult. You go to a conference and you meet poets, and most poets have something written or they're on their way to completing a manuscript. And so I would mostly meet poets at first just through conferences and AWP and working with EWU Press and Lynx House Press. And I would just meet them and get manuscripts that way, just have them handed to me. And then when I started the Idaho Prize and that got rolling, then more manuscripts came in from poets who I did not know. And now that contest, we usually get 500 to 600 manuscripts for that. So quite a few now. And at the beginning, it still wasn't trouble to find poets, because whether they knew Lost Horse Press or not, there were still so many poets and so few. And my mission, even in the beginning, I thought that the vision for the press, I was hoping that I would get, a better quality of poet, and famous poet would want to publish with Lost Horse Press. But when a press hasn't proven itself yet, you have to be able to willing to take in manuscripts that are good by not so well-known poets. And that, to me, after I gave a lot of thought to that, and I thought, it wouldn't be a bad mission to help emerging poets, because so many poets said to me that they couldn't get published because they weren't known and no one would take a chance on them. And I can understand that now. With a press, you publish an unknown poet, and basically their family and friends list is about all you're going to sell. People in America, the readers in America, still are not willing to take a chance to spend money on a book of poetry that they don't know anything about the author, which is
although there are so many, not just the Yale series of younger poets, but there are a number of sort of first book publishing prizes that give a lot of attention to new poets with their first book, which is very helpful. And then, of course, what you started, and I thought that was wonderful, with the late, our dear beloved Marvin Bell, the New Poets series. And she was so supportive of that. And describe the format of that.
Well, I will. And I'm going to do it in Marvin's words, because he wrote such a quirky little paragraph for that. So if you don't mind, I'll read it.
Absolutely.
And, the idea for the series is indebted to poets of today. The Scribner series, edited by John Hall Wheelock from 1954 to 1962, which published in 8 volumes, first books by 24 poets, 3 poets at a time, under a single cover.
Right.
The increased promotion in recent years of American poetry on many levels owes much to a dumbing down of the art and the proliferation of novelty acts. Yet the country is also, you can hear Marvin saying this, yet the country is also chock full of little published poets of high seriousness. This 3-in-1 series, then, is intended to sample a range of poets who have yet to publish a book and have generally gone about their writing in private. It will not be run as a contest, nor will it accept submissions. The usual biographical notes will be replaced by brief personal statements. Its covers will not carry promotional blurbs. I believe that, in the matter of poetry, 2 heads are half as good as 1. Therefore, the poems in these short books will be selected and arranged by their authors with minimal editorial interference. The poets will not be asked to adjust their poetry to a house style. I hope that these samplings, presented with as few trappings as possible, will reaffirm for readers the nature of the poetry in poetry. Serious poetry is not written to satisfy literary opinion. Poetry, like philosophy, is a survival skill.
That is wonderful. I would love to quote that. Poetry is a survival skill. You know, that is amazing. And Marvin was dedicated to that series for several years. And I hadn't realized that he had modeled it on an earlier series, you know, from John Hall Wheelock. So that's amazing. So there's the New Poets series, which I guess is not active at this point, but the Native American Poets series and the Human Rights series are certainly, you know, they're more occasional. There isn't like a new volume every year, but could you say something about those? Pardon? Go ahead.
Yeah, as projects come along,
right,
and fit one of those 2 series, and I'm still working with Henry Reelbird.
Oh, good.
Crow Native American man, and he's a teacher and a poet. And Henry and I had a conversation about this, and I will be going to the Crow Reservation and to the schools there to help them set up their own publishing program. But I didn't want to step in and just take over and say, okay, I'm the poetry publisher for the Native Americans here out west. This wasn't going to be my role. Henry and I had a nice meeting, and he submitted his manuscripts to me on yellow lined paper. I would get a great big brown shopping bag full of yellow lined paper with handwritten poems and drawings and all sorts of notes in there. And then he and I would talk on the phone and put together the manuscript.
Wow.
So it was fun working with him, but I feel that just like with the Ukrainians, it was similar, the parallel stories with the development of the Ukrainian poetry series. You know, Native Americans should have the opportunity to develop their own publishing, and I hope that I can help with that, but I did not want to become the sole
Right.
Publisher for them. And I published Lois Red Elk's poetry and several of Henry's books. And now I'm just waiting to when they're going to be ready to set up their own program and help with that. And the human rights series was, I felt, very important, and I still do feel it's important. There's some great books in that, including Raising Lily Ledbetter, which still sells copies of books. I think that the Nasty Women Poets is part of that. Consider that part of the series too.
Yeah.
And so that one, yes, you're right. Books will come in slowly. Manuscripts will come in, and if they fit into the human rights series, then there's a book there. But I don't push that too much.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I see that Melissa Kwasny is here because her book, her anthology, I Go to the Ruined Place, was, I think, the first in the human rights series. And that was a phenomenally courageous project to take on at the time. You know, I guess it was, after 9/11 and after all these wars of choice based on lies that this country had undertaken. And I know Marvin had a poem in there, and any number of strong poets and a few poets in translation. So that was good. And then there was the Israeli-Palestinian one, which was controversial and quite an editorial task. But I hope that yeah, but I remember how we started the Raising Lily Ledbetter started with our conversation on the train coming back from one of the AWP conferences in Chicago. And you were saying something about, Carolyne, it would be great to do another book with you. What do you have in mind? And I said, well, I've been thinking about women in work ever since Obama signed the Equal Pay Act. What do we know about women in work? And what do poets write about work? Women poets write about work. So that's how that one came about. And then soon thereafter came Nasty Women Poets, of course, based on that nasty comment that nasty man made about Hillary Clinton. And so that in its great flaming pink glory has been a very high-spirited anthology. And I'm very glad to have a poem in it, and there were a lot of fun readings about both of these, from both of these. And the
other thing I like about the human rights series, it parallels the vision for the press, because I always envisioned that the press would help emerging poets and publish people like, I published Robert Pack and Christopher Howell, very well-known poets, as well as emerging poets. And in all of the human rights series books, there are poems from emerging poets, and there are poems from very well-known poets.
Right.
So that I think is the one quality that I like about the vision for the press, and also I'm glad it's come out in this human rights series, as it should.
Yeah, and I think that has been a series that I'm very happy about the existence of that series and its focus on issues of urgent social concern. And so I will suggest right here, you'll hear it here first. Maybe the next thing should be an anthology of some of the Ukrainian poets, as well as the individual volumes, the dual language volumes, maybe an anthology in the human rights series having to do with, the poems in response to this current war. But also the current war has all of this resonance going back to World War II and before, to Stalin's purges and the famine. What is it? The Holodomor? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Yeah. And that is, there is so much history to be covered. And I get the feeling from Ukrainian poetry that there is, in all of the contemporary poetry, the presence of the history, not just the older, the history from 1,000 years ago, but the history of the last century and the century before that, and all of these conflicts that have rolled over that part of Europe, So maybe that is something that, I wouldn't necessarily be involved with it, but I could be sort of watching, helpfully cheering from the sidelines. But that would be a great thing to do, including a few poems from each of the poets that have been published in the contemporary Ukrainian poetry series already, and some others, So that's a possibility.
Yes, it is.
So, let's focus now on the, the Ukrainian series. I mean, because we all know that on February 24th, Russia's war criminal Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of tanks and trucks, and, it's your family's homeland. And, all of those 190,000 troops were surrounding Ukraine on three sides for several months. And we were all, so on edge, not knowing what was going to happen. And then, of course, the troops began moving in. And, before that, of course, was the seizure of Crimea and the so-called breakaway republics, right, Luhansk and Donetsk, if I'm pronouncing that halfway correctly. And so basically, Ukraine has been at war in those parts of Ukraine since 2014. And now this new extension of that war on a massive scale since, February 24th. So I think all of this is, incredibly ironic, sad, wonderful, but terrible that this surge of interest in the literature and the culture of Ukraine as a result of this. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. I mean, we've been talking about this, and it's been quite a journey for Lost Horse Press. Yeah,
when I started the series in 2017,
right.
I was very excited about it, and I was sure that the minute the books came out, everyone in America would want one. A copy of the first book was by Irina Stadavoit, and A Field of Foundlings, it's titled, and translated by actually my partner in this venture, Grace Mahoney. And that's not what happened. People, a few people bought the books. The Slavic studies programs at universities were made aware of the series, and they weren't selling very well. The second one came out, the third one came out, and I wasn't discouraged because I thought, I'm still doing this. It's a labor of love. It's for my country, for my family, and I was going to keep doing it no matter what. But the books started to sell a little bit more rapidly as they were published, because the Slavic studies programs started to use them. So Harvard discovered them, and the production of the books is very good. As you know, Caroline, I use very good paper, and the books are lovely. So
and it's interesting too, because I'm a translator also from one language which is very commonly translated, Spanish, and one that is much less translated, which is Bengali. And in my awareness from having attended any number of American Literary Translators Association conferences and having been involved with a lot of other translators, especially of poetry, through that organization, Ukrainian was not a language that you heard very much about. So you were serving, at least at the beginning, a sort of a niche market that had not really been explored very much. But
absolutely. And the writers that we were getting, and Grace and I started the series not exactly together. I had the idea for it. I was wondering how I could do this because I'm sitting in, at that time I was living in Sandpoint, Idaho, in the wilds of Idaho, not in touch with anybody. And I thought, well, how am I going to find poets? And I was talking to a Polish poet who's studying for his PhD in LA.
Yeah, Piotr.
Yeah, Piotr Florchek. And he knew of Grace, and he said, oh, I'll have to get you two together. And that's exactly what he did. And Grace was in Ukraine doing research, and she was the one who could acquire the manuscripts for our series. So Grace and I worked together, and now I say that the two of us established the Ukrainian series. When she was in Ukraine, she had met a lot of poets, going to poetry conferences, and I was amazed. We have published the top poets in Ukraine. Serhei Zhadan is the top poet of Ukraine, and we have a manuscript of his. So it's true that there weren't many other than Harvard and a couple of other little presses. No one else was publishing Ukrainian poetry in translation. Most of this has to do with the fact that if the books don't sell, most presses are not financially able to just carry books. I was going to do it no matter what, if I had to put my own money into it, but I didn't have to. And so the books languished pretty much when we kept publishing them. We had 8 books. Many of them do talk about the war because we started in the series in 2014. And as we got manuscripts, closer to 2017, 2018, poets were already writing about the war. So Lyuba Yakimchuk's Apricots of Donbass is about her family's experiences when the Russians marched into her town, and she had to leave. She had a 3-year-old child, and she fled to Kiev. Her parents did not want to go, and they stayed behind until it got way too dangerous, and she was able to go and fetch them and bring them to Kiev as well. So the poetry series did not sell very well until February, end of February. And now we can't keep the books in print. We can't keep stock at the warehouse. And I hoard them here so that I can fill orders. And my printer is now printing 250 of one of my titles every other day and sending them to the warehouse. And we're trying to keep them in stock. Amazon is not the best place to get them because it takes so long to get from the University of Washington Press's distribution warehouse in Fredericksburg, Pennsylvania, to wherever they have to go to Amazon. And both Amazon and the warehouse for the University of Washington are so big that it takes about a week for them to put the books where they belong and catalog them and get them so that they know that they have them in their system. So actually it's much easier to order from me or from the University of Washington Press rather than Amazon. And we all know that Amazon is the evil empire. So we don't want to anyone there.
I wanted to ask you, though, okay, I know that one of the books, I don't remember exactly which one it was, won a fairly major translation award a couple of years ago. And I remember that you posted about that on the news page for the Lost Horse website. And I was going, hey, this is great.
Well, this is Serhei Zhadan, who was the rock star of Ukraine. His book is entitled A New Orthography, and in 2021 it won the PEN Penn Prize for translation.
Yes, and that's a major. That is, in the world of literary translation, that is one of the major awards. So I was going, this series is now firmly established. And
it also
then
won the 2022 Eric Walcott Prize.
That too. All right. So that really is, I mean, that's major. Those are major awards. But still, beyond the world of poetry and literary translation, still it would be like, who's that? Major orthography? What language? But then February 24th happened. And I wanted to ask you, what was the first sign for you? What was the first thing that happened? When was your first sense that this was going to just explode? And I mean metaphorically, figuratively, because, you know, we don't want to talk about the literal explosions going on in Ukraine. But when did you know? What was the first response that you got? The first phone call, the first email, whatever. And how did it happen? Right?
Good question, Caroline. I think I got a call from the managing editor of the University of Washington Press asking me how many copies of several books did I have. And he sounded very panicked. And I said, well, I have quite a few of a new orthography, but not as many Apricots of Donbass, because I've been getting lots of orders for those. And he said, well, we're going to need thousands of copies. Our usual print run is 300 to 400 books. And when we get rid of those, then usually then I can start asking for 50 copies from my printer. It's a small printer here in Spokane, Washington, but he does a marvelous job. But neither he nor I were expecting anything like this. And so that's why the printer has come up with this schedule, 250 books. And he continues to print 250 books every other day. I send him the inserts that go in the boxes on top of the boxes, and he actually sends them out for me so that I don't have an extra step of going to the printer, picking up the books and labeling everything. He just does it for me and sends them to the warehouse. So basically, right now, I've lost count of how many books have gone to the warehouse. They're now just going every other day.
Well, I hope he's keeping a record of the number of copies printed of each of the titles.
I pay for them, Carol, and he's keeping a very count.
That's great. So then tell us a little bit about, and we have some requests for you to read one of the poems in Ukrainian as well as English. But while you think about that, I'd like to know a little bit about who else has contacted you, from out there in the great world of media,
Oh, the great world of media. I was contacted by, another Ukrainian, there's a Ukrainian kind of a clearinghouse for translation of Ukrainian in America now, run by a Ukrainian woman named Zhenya Tompkins. I think it's called the Talt Institute for Ukrainian Translation, or maybe the Tompkins. Anyway, she contacted me and said, we have a producer from the Grammys who is asking if one of your poets can be brought to Los Angeles or Las Vegas to read at the Grammys. I was just bowled over. I said, well, what are you talking about? And she said, yes, this is real. They want to bring Lyuba Yakimchuk to America to read at the Grammys.
So they had already decided on her. Had they already decided on her?
Yeah, they had. Zhenya had sent them to my website so that they could read about each of the books. And this is just so shallow of them, but they liked the way she looked.
That's what I was thinking. You know, she didn't have a sort of a stubbly beard and kind of wearing a ragged T-shirt, you know.
Right. So
although what's his name? Justin Bieber can look like that, you know, but when it's a woman, she's got to be very, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. And which was fine. You know, I didn't have any trouble with them selecting any one of the Ukrainian poets because I know how serious these poets are. Yeah. Luba's book just happens to, the whole book addresses the apricots of Donbass that she's talking about. In her village, they were a stone's throw from the Russian border. And her village was filled with apricot trees. And the apricot trees stopped at the border, and they never, not even a seed, not one apricot rolled across the border and implanted itself there. And she was always, she said that always amazed her, that there wasn't a single apricot tree in the Russian side, but they were all over on their side, and how beautifully they bloomed in the springtime. So you know, besides her, you know, her looks, how beautiful she is, the entire book, and it's very, very powerful. You know, she talks about running. I mean, basically walking out of her village to get out. Right. So that was a good choice for them, and she felt that they were very kind and concerned. The producer who worked with her actually cried when he talked to her about some of this. And I felt that the production was beautiful. They matched her up with Legend. Oh my goodness.
I hope everybody here saw that, the Grammys. It was very brief. First, President Zelensky gave a taped address, and then came on that, the John Legend, the pianist, playing, and then with two Ukrainian musicians, a singer in a blue gown, and then what was the instrument the other woman was playing?
Bandura.
Pardon?
Bandura.
Bandura, and she was wearing a gold gown, and then Luba came on with a black gown, which looked blue in the lights overhead, even though I saw that it was black, but it was just beautifully. And she held the poem. I don't know if it was her cell phone or a little iPad or something, but she read it in English to the musical accompaniment. It was phenomenal. So
John Legend just put it on YouTube.
Okay. So we can find
look
it.
Up John Legend, and you'll find if anyone hasn't seen it and would like to.
Right.
Also, it should be on my website by now. We're getting a new website for Lusthurst Press. It has not been released live yet, so I'm not sure whether the designer put that on our old website and the new one, or just the new one. Will be.
So, but there were a few other. There were a few. You know, moments leading up to that. I remember seeing reviews in I think the Zvinia Orlovsky's translation. That book was reviewed in the Washington Post, and also in, I think it was in Literary Hub, and there were a few other reviews in major outlets of various of the books. And then
first time in 25 years of publishing that I've been asked for the books for review, rather than my having to send them out and begging for reviews. This is the very first time. The Ukrainian books started it, but then your book also, Masquerade, I've been asked for a copy of it for review. So I think Lusthurst Press has finally made a mark in the literary world when reviewers are asking me, magazines are asking me for the books for review. I feel really good about that.
Yeah, and that's amazing because it's suddenly, it's a whole other scale of presentation, of interaction. And I'm so happy about this. So you had some indirect contact with what was the lady's name, Zhenya, who was in touch with the Grammy people, and her people got in touch with their people, or their people got in touch with her people, and somebody got in touch with your people, but you are your people. There's nobody but you. So you are your people. And yeah.
That's how it worked.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are getting a lot more publicity and a lot more recognition. And like I said, I think that I was meant to make books. I was born to make books. It came to me late, and then the press had to prove itself before I was allowed, before I had the resources through Grace Mahoney to even start a Ukrainian poetry series. And to do it correctly and to do it well. I needed experience and time, and this was the time. So I feel like I'm at the apex of my career right now.
Can I have a little comment here?
Absolutely.
Does anyone who's, in the audience have any questions for Christine about the press?
Kate, I see Kate has a question. Yeah.
Unmute yourself, Kate.
The vicissitudes.
Believe it. My question is, Christine, you suggested that we order the book directly from you rather than going anywhere else, that you would be able to pass that order on. So what, is that something you could put in the chat of where we would order it? Is it just right from?
Oh, yeah, it's right through the website.
I put the website on. I put the website address on.
Perfect.
Okay.
So
Good.
if you go to the website or University of Washington Press website.
Yeah.
Okay, I see it.
I'll do it. Yeah, you see it? Okay, because I can do it again. Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah, and Christine spends, from what I understand, you spend most days, all day, packing up books to send.
Yeah, as I have been. Are there any other questions?
Yeah. There was the request for you to read one of the poems, and if possible, in both languages.
Well, I'm not going to read it in both languages because although I was taught to speak, I was not sent to Saturday Ukrainian school as a child because the schools were just too far away from my home, and so I read like a third grader. So I don't want to do that to anyone, but I will read a poem. This is, let me get back to my seat, and I'll show you. The very latest book is called "The Country Where Everyone's Name is Fear." It's by two Ukrainian poets. They're married, Boris and Lyudmila Khersansky, who are from Odessa. And Ilya Kaminsky and Katie Ferris are the editors of the book.
And they are a couple, right? Ilya and Katie are the married
Ilya
couple.
and Katie are a couple, and Boris and Lyudmila are a couple. And so I will, let's see, I could read a couple because the Lyudmila did not write poems about the war, but Boris did. So this one is, maybe I'll read the title. In a Country Where Everyone's Name is Fear. And this is by Lyudmila Khersansky, translated by Grace Mahoney. In a country where everyone's name is fear, it's good that you don't see a thing and don't hear a thing. Say to anyone, not a thing. Slip nothing in your bra. Keep nothing in your pocket. In both ears, nothing. In two eyes, nothing. Blind feet, no looking back, no looking back. If you look back, my brave, if, my brave, you look back, my brave, you say nothing. When you arrive to a new destination, They will learn nothing from you. They will learn what nothing is.
Wow.
And this one is by Boris Khersonsky. Against the backdrop of silent muses. Against the backdrop of silent muses, heavy gunfire thunders louder against the background of grieving windows. The clowns laugh louder. The rich are happy, but we're poor and unhappy against the blue skied background. The crowds of clouds are terrifying. What won't drown in a river will overgrow with grass. Against the background drop of bleeding flocks, there's more room for the howling wolves. Where there's a market, there's a thief and conniving. And then there's a shank in your ribcage or gunshots at point blank. Against the backdrop of the good, there's room for evil. In the fire, there's always something that could turn to ash. A knife in someone's pocket and a knife in your pocket. Against the background of lies, it's not apparent that we are also liars. And that was translated by Javier Zamora with Oksana Maximchuk.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So there are now 10 books in the series, I think?
10 books.
Yep. So that is amazing. So, and thank you so much for reading. I'm thinking that at some point, perhaps you will have time and a little bit of free time to practice doing some recitation from Ukrainian in the future. I'm sure you'll pick it up quickly.
I'll have to memorize.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, but that would be wonderful. So 10 books in the series, and there are more to come. And Susan Platt is asking, where are your poets now? I guess the Ukrainian poets who have been in the series so far. Where are they living?
Boris and Ludmila are in Italy now. Some of the translators are in Hungary, but Luba Yakimchuk and her husband both took lessons in Kiev to learn how to shoot, and they are defending their country. Sergei Zhadan is defending his country. He's in Kharkiv. Wow. So please pray for these poets, because Ukrainians will not leave. I have family that I said, please come. My house is big enough. All of you come. We'll sleep on the floors. It'll be fine. And not one of them, some of them are in their 80s, and they're staying to defend their country. Yeah, it's very difficult. It's just been very, very difficult, this whole war. And Ukraine is losing brain power. They're losing a lot of young, very talented people, and people from other countries. I noticed there was a filmmaker from Lithuania who was just killed. It's frightening, and this war has to stop soon.
And you've lost some family as well.
I lost a cousin to the war. He was the head of a volunteer squad, and since 2014, he would drive supplies to the front lines, to the soldiers in the Ukrainian front, and each time he would take a different vehicle so that he wouldn't be recognized by the Russians. And since 2014, I've been so afraid for him. And just last week, he was shot by Russians.
God. And his name was Ruslan
Koval.
Koval. Oh. Let's pray for Ruslan Koval and all of the other Ukrainians, yes, whether they are poets or people in any walk of life. And let's hope that this war ends soon, but that the poetry continues. So I wanted to ask you one more question as we look forward into the future. What is next for Lost Horse Press? What is your vision for what is to come?
Well, I'm going to be 70 years old in November. And so I'm not thinking of quitting, but I am starting to think about who I can pass this nonprofit to. And I am talking to Grace Mahoney and to Jackson Holbert, who is the young man who helps me with the Idaho Prize. And hopefully either one or both of them will be interested in continuing.
Mm-hmm.
I know Grace has said that she is interested because the Harvard publishing group, they publish, there's a arm of the Harvard Press that publishes Ukrainian books, mostly nonfiction, but they also have admired the Lost Horse series and said they would take them on if I ever gave up the press and they would take those books on and continue to print them and sell them. So something will go on with Lost Horse Press. It's not completely congealed yet, but I'm working in that direction.
But so far, you're going to continue to hold the Idaho Prize, publish 4 to 6 books every season, including a Ukrainian title or 2, and some other books, books by long-standing
U.S.
Horse
poets. That's
yes,
right.
Yes,
And emerging and experienced poets. Again, one thing I'm really proud of is I think there are 3 or 4 winners of the Idaho Prize where it was their first book.
Right.
And, they won the $1,000. They were, touted, and they got the Idaho Prize, winner of the Idaho Prize on the front of their book. And we always have a wonderful final judge. So they feel proud because a very good judge selected their book. And that makes me feel good that they got a step up from the press.
Yeah, I think that was the case with Essie Stone, right? She was selected by Gary Copeland Lilly. And Gary's done a wonderful book with Lost Horse as well. And so, yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Well, may you live long and may you continue to do, I think there's longevity in your family. And so hopefully Lost Horse Press can continue as it is, perhaps on at least 1 or 2 quantum steps up in terms of funding coming in and, Lost Horse Press's, reach out into the world, extended. And so, thank you so much, Christine, for speaking to us.
From your lips to God's ears, Caroline.
So, yes, Caroline and Christine, this has been a wonderful hour, and I'm so proud that we hosted you. And we're going to say goodnight to everyone now. And
thank you, Phoebe, and thank you, Tom, for being the IT person. Hello, Carolyn Hunt. There's another quote I published.
Yes. And yeah, Catherine and I are doing an event next Sunday at Village Books in Bellingham, Fairhaven. So we will be reading together in person.
Oh, great!
So that's we'll be posting on Facebook about that even more than we have.
Yeah, it's good to see more in-person stuff. Yes.
Yeah, it's happening. We're slowly emerging, and Luba, she got there to Las Vegas, put on her fancy, what is it? Kind of a ball gown, not a ball gown, a nightclub outfit. And then is she back there with her AK-47 or whatever, her and fighting on the front in camouflage or whatever, Is she already back in Ukraine? She might be.
Yeah, I think so. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you so much, everybody.
I
And
just put some information in the chat about the next Raven Talks event. If you're interested, that's in later this month on April 27th.
yes, that'll be great. That'll be great. And I have saved the chat too. So
Okay, good.
That's good. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, and good night. And
Thank you.
Godspeed and be
This is
safe.
great.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone. Good night, Natalie.
Good night, Natalie. And